On the morning of October 13th, 1899, the residents of Selkirk, Montana, awoke to an impossible sight that would haunt their community for generations. 7 beds in the Thornfield household lay undisturbed, their covers still tucked with military precision as they had been the night before. Yet the rooms felt as empty as abandoned graves. The 7 daughters of prominent merchant Gabriel Thornfield, Margaret, 26, Catherine, 24, twins Eleanor and Elizabeth, 22, Sarah, 20, Grace, 17, and Rebecca, just 14, had vanished without leaving so much as a footprint in the morning frost that covered their windowsills. No windows showed signs of forced entry, no doors had been left ajar, and most disturbing of all, their nightgowns hung precisely where they had placed them before retiring, as if the sisters had simply dissolved into the autumn air. The local sheriff's report, sealed by federal order for nearly 8 decades, contained a single chilling detail that authorities refused to discuss with anyone, including the sisters' own father. Each bedroom showed evidence of having been methodically searched by someone intimately familiar with the house's layout. Yet nothing whatsoever was missing. Not jewelry, not clothing, not even the small amounts of money the older sisters kept in their dresser drawers. What happened to the 7 sisters of Selkirk remains one of America's most haunting and inexplicable unsolved mysteries. And the truth buried in those dusty government files reveals a conspiracy of greed, corruption, and human trafficking that reaches far deeper than anyone in that isolated Montana town dared imagine. Before we continue with the story of the Thornfield sisters and uncover the shocking evidence that has been deliberately hidden from the public for over a century, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark historical mysteries that reveal the hidden truths of America's past. Also, let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world, and your engagement helps us bring these forgotten stories back to light. The investigation that followed would expose not just the fate of 7 innocent young women, but an entire network of predators who had been systematically destroying families across the American frontier for decades. The autumn wind that swept down from the Bitterroot Mountains and through the streets of Selkirk carried with it the mingled scents of wood smoke, fallen leaves, and the ever-present metallic tang of silver ore that had transformed this forgotten corner of Montana territory into one of the most prosperous communities between Denver and Seattle. In 1899, Selkirk was a town caught between 2 worlds, the rough-hewn frontier settlement it had been just a decade earlier, and the refined community it aspired to become as Eastern money and influence flowed westward along the newly completed Northern Pacific Railroad line. With a population that had swelled to nearly 800 souls, Selkirk represented everything that Americans in the late 19th century believed about opportunity, progress, and the endless possibilities of Western expansion. The main street buzzed with activity from dawn until well past sunset. Freight wagons loaded with silver ore rumbling toward the railway depot, well-dressed businessmen stepping off the evening train from Chicago and New York, and families who had traveled thousands of miles for the chance to build new lives in a place where a man's worth was measured by his determination rather than his pedigree. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and progress lay the same tensions that plagued communities throughout the American West. The rapid influx of money and people had created sharp divisions between the established families who had survived the lean early years and the newcomers who arrived with Eastern capital and sophisticated business connections. Labor disputes simmered constantly between the miners who risked their lives daily in the silver shafts and the investors who lived in comfort hundreds of miles away. Most troubling of all were the whispered concerns about young women who had arrived with their families, but then mysteriously departed for opportunities in distant cities, leaving behind only vague explanations and tearful farewells. At the center of Selkirk's transformation stood Gabriel Thornfield, a man whose remarkable success story had become legendary throughout the territory, but was beginning to attract uncomfortable scrutiny from those who wondered how a simple dry goods merchant had accumulated such extraordinary wealth in such a short time. Gabriel had arrived in Selkirk during the brutal winter of 1892, driving a single wagon loaded with basic supplies and accompanied by his 7 daughters, his wife having died of pneumonia during their journey from Ohio. The sight of this determined widower and his children, huddled around a campfire in the bitter cold, had moved the established residents to offer assistance, and Gabriel had quickly established himself as both a shrewd businessman and a devoted father. Within 2 years, Gabriel's modest general store had expanded to become the largest commercial establishment between Butte and Missoula. He had negotiated exclusive contracts with mining companies, established trading relationships with suppliers in Chicago and San Francisco, and somehow secured the financing necessary to build the most impressive private residence in 3 counties. The 3-story Victorian mansion on Maple Street, with its elaborate gingerbread trim, stained glass windows and wraparound porch, served as both a symbol of his success and a testament to his devotion to providing his daughters with every advantage that wealth could buy. The 7 Thornfield sisters had grown into young women who were admired and respected throughout the community, each developing distinct personalities and talents that contributed to Selkirk's cultural and social life. Margaret, the eldest, possessed a sharp intellect and natural leadership abilities that had made her the most effective teacher the town school had ever employed. Her progressive teaching methods, which emphasized critical thinking and practical skills over rote memorization, had drawn praise from parents and education officials as far away as Helena. She was known for staying late to help struggling students, organizing advanced classes for gifted children, and advocating tirelessly for better resources and facilities. Catherine, just 2 years younger than Margaret, had inherited their mother's artistic talents and had transformed them into a passion that enriched the entire community. Her paintings, landscapes that captured the rugged beauty of Montana's mountains and valleys, portraits that revealed the character and dignity of frontier families, and still, lives that found beauty in the simple objects of daily life, adorned homes and businesses throughout Selkirk. She had organized cultural events that brought refinement and entertainment to the frontier town, including concerts, art exhibitions, and literary discussions that attracted visitors from neighboring communities. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, were inseparable companions who had channeled their natural ability with needle and thread into a thriving seamstress business that employed several local women and provided services ranging from simple alterations to elaborate wedding gowns. Their shop had become a gathering place where women could discuss community affairs, share news, and support each other through the challenges of frontier life. Despite their identical appearance, the twins had developed distinct personalities. Eleanor was the more outgoing and business-minded, while Elizabeth possessed a quiet wisdom that made her a trusted confidant for many of Selkirk's residents. Sarah, 20 years old and blessed with a voice that could fill the Methodist Church without strain, had become the heart of Selkirk's religious and charitable activities. She organized the church choir, directed holiday pageants that drew audiences from throughout the valley, and led fundraising efforts for families affected by mining accidents or other tragedies. Her compassion and organizational skills had made her indispensable to the community's efforts to care for its most vulnerable members, including widows, orphans, and injured miners. Grace, at 17, had already demonstrated a mathematical ability that astounded her teachers and made her invaluable to her father's increasingly complex business operations. She could calculate compound interest in her head, balance multiple sets of books simultaneously, and spot discrepancies in financial records that escaped the notice of experienced bookkeepers. Her father had begun consulting her on major business decisions, and several prominent businessmen had remarked that Grace possessed the sharpest financial mind they had ever encountered in someone so young. Rebecca, the youngest at 14, brought joy and laughter to everyone around her with an infectious personality that could brighten even the darkest winter day. Despite her youth, she had already shown remarkable maturity by volunteering at the town's small library, where she read to children whose parents worked long hours in the mines or shops. Her natural empathy and genuine interest in others had made her beloved by families throughout Selkirk, and many predicted she would grow up to become a teacher or nurse who would continue her family's tradition of service to the community. The Thornfield family's prominence in Selkirk society, however, had begun to attract attention that Gabriel found increasingly uncomfortable. Some residents whispered that his rapid accumulation of wealth suggested connections to powerful interests back east, while others questioned how a man who had arrived with virtually nothing had secured the financing necessary to build such an elaborate home and expand his business so dramatically. These suspicions intensified during the summer and early autumn of 1899, as Gabriel began hosting private meetings with well-dressed strangers who arrived on the evening train and departed before dawn, conducting their business in hushed conversations behind the closed doors of his study. The political and economic climate of 1899 added another layer of tension to life in Selkirk and throughout the American West. The nation was still recovering from the devastating economic depression that had begun in 1893, and the effects of bank failures, business closures, and unemployment continued to ripple through communities that had previously enjoyed steady prosperity. Labor disputes were becoming increasingly common and violent in mining communities throughout Montana, Colorado, and Idaho, as workers organized to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and protection from the arbitrary power of distant investors who viewed frontier laborers as expendable resources. The recently formed Western Federation of Miners had been actively organizing workers throughout Montana, and several mines in neighboring towns had experienced strikes that sometimes turned violent when mine owners brought in armed guards or called upon territorial authorities for military intervention. Local business owners, including Gabriel Thornfield, found themselves caught between the legitimate demands of their workers and the expectations of Eastern investors who cared little for the welfare of frontier communities and demanded maximum profits regardless of human cost. This volatile atmosphere was further complicated by the rapid changes that railroad expansion had brought to previously isolated communities. The Northern Pacific's extension to Selkirk in 1896 had brought unprecedented prosperity, but it had also exposed the town to outside influences and criminal organizations that preyed upon frontier families. Reports circulated of confidence men, land speculators, and various criminal enterprises that followed the railroad lines westward, seeking opportunities to exploit the isolation and limited law enforcement resources of frontier settlements. The events of October 12, 1899, began with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made residents of Selkirk grateful for their decision to build lives in Montana's spectacular landscape. The maple trees that lined the town's main streets had reached their peak autumn colors, creating a canopy of gold and crimson that filtered the morning sunlight into patterns of extraordinary beauty. Gabriel Thornfield opened his general store at 7 o'clock sharp, as was his unchanging custom, while his daughters went about their established daily routines with the comfortable predictability that had characterized their family life for years. Margaret walked to the one-room schoolhouse at 8 o'clock, her leather satchel filled with the lesson plans she had prepared the evening before. Parents gathering at the school entrance noticed that she seemed more distracted than usual, responding to their greetings with polite but absent-minded nods, rather than her typical warm engagement with their concerns about their children's progress. Several mothers later recalled that Margaret's usually immaculate appearance seemed slightly disheveled, as if she had dressed hastily or without her normal attention to detail. Catherine set up her easel in the garden behind the family home, where she had been working for several weeks on a landscape painting that captured the autumn transformation of the Bitterroot Mountains. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh, who lived across the street and often watched Catherine work from her kitchen window, noticed that the young artist seemed unable to concentrate on her painting, frequently setting down her brush to pace around the garden or stare toward the train station at the edge of town. Most unusually, Catherine appeared to be painting the same small section of canvas over and over again, as if her hands couldn't execute what her mind was trying to create. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, opened their seamstress shop at 9 o'clock and immediately began working on the elaborate wedding dress they were creating for Mayor Harrison's daughter. However, their usual cheerful chatter was replaced by intense whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever customers entered the shop. Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, who brought in a jacket for alterations, later testified that the twins seemed nervous and distracted, making uncharacteristic mistakes in their measurements and having to restart their work several times. Sarah spent the morning at the Methodist church practicing hymns for the upcoming Sunday service, but Reverend Thomas Atwood noticed that her usually perfect pitch seemed uncertain, and she repeatedly stopped mid-song to stare out the windows toward the main street. When he asked if something was troubling her, Sarah's response was evasive and uncharacteristic. She claimed to be feeling slightly unwell, but refused his offer to summon Dr. Porter or to send word to her father. Grace worked in the general store alongside her father, but several customers commented that she seemed unusually quiet and made simple arithmetic errors that were completely unlike her normally flawless mathematical abilities. Gabriel himself appeared tense and distracted, frequently checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the street as if expecting someone or something that failed to arrive on schedule. Even young Rebecca, normally the most carefree and talkative of the sisters, seemed subdued as she helped Mrs. Caldwell with the household's daily cleaning and preparation for the evening meal. The housekeeper later recalled that Rebecca asked several unusual questions about travel, whether she had ever been far from Montana, whether she missed her family when she had worked in other towns, and whether she thought it was possible to be happy when separated from everyone you loved. As the afternoon progressed, the subtle disturbances that had marked the sisters' behavior throughout the day became more pronounced. At approximately 3 o'clock, Dr. Samuel Porter was returning from a house call when he encountered all 7 sisters walking together along River Street in the direction of the train depot. This struck him as highly unusual, since their daily routines typically kept them occupied with their individual responsibilities during the afternoon hours, and he had never seen them all together away from the family home except during church services or special community events. What disturbed Dr. Porter most profoundly was the sisters' demeanor as they walked. Normally vibrant, talkative, and engaged with everyone they encountered, the 7 young women moved in complete silence, their faces pale and their expressions troubled in ways that suggested deep emotional distress. They walked with the mechanical precision of people who were forcing themselves to complete an unpleasant but unavoidable task, their usual grace and natural warmth replaced by a rigid determination that seemed almost military in its intensity. When Dr. Porter called out a cheerful greeting, only Rebecca looked back, and the fear in her young eyes chilled him to the bone. The girl's face, normally animated with laughter and curiosity, wore an expression of terror that seemed completely incompatible with the safe, familiar surroundings of their hometown. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Dr. Porter later swore that Rebecca's gaze conveyed a desperate plea for help that she was powerless to voice aloud. The last confirmed sighting of the Thornfield sisters as a group came from Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk at the telegraph office, whose window provided an unobstructed view of the main street and the wooden sidewalks where the town's residents conducted their evening business. At approximately 9:15, Fletcher glanced up from his work, transcribing messages, to observe all 7 sisters standing together beneath the amber glow of the street lamp directly outside his office window. Their positioning and body language struck Fletcher as extraordinary and troubling. Rather than the casual arrangement of sisters engaged in conversation or family business, they stood in a precise line facing toward the train station, their posture rigid and their attention focused with an intensity that suggested both anticipation and dread. They appeared to be waiting for something or someone specific, their stillness so complete that Fletcher initially wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the uncertain lamplight. What made this sighting particularly significant was the unusual nature of their clothing. Instead of the practical work dresses or comfortable evening wear they typically chose for family activities, all 7 sisters were dressed in their finest garments, elaborate dresses more suitable for special occasions or formal social events than for an ordinary Thursday evening in Selkirk. Their hair was arranged with a formality that suggested careful preparation, and each wore jewelry that Fletcher had only seen them display during church services or community celebrations. Most disturbing of all was the collective expression visible on their faces in the lamplight. Rather than the excitement or pleasure that might accompany preparations for a special event, the sisters displayed a combination of resignation and fear that suggested they were steeling themselves for an ordeal rather than anticipating a celebration. When Fletcher looked up from his work again approximately 10 minutes later, they had vanished as silently and mysteriously as they had appeared. The hours that followed remain among the most puzzling aspects of the entire mystery, largely because the only witness to events within the Thornfield household was Gabriel himself, whose account of the evening would later prove to contain significant inconsistencies and omissions. According to his initial statement to Sheriff Harding, Gabriel retired to his study at approximately 10 o'clock to review business correspondence that had arrived on the afternoon train. He claimed to have spent roughly 90 minutes reading letters and updating his business records, a routine that had been his invariable custom for years. Mrs. Caldwell, the family's housekeeper and the only non-family member with regular access to the household, finished her evening duties and departed for her own cottage at precisely 10:30, as was her established routine. Her later testimony provided crucial details about the atmosphere within the house during those final hours. She described an unusual quietness that seemed to pervade the entire building. None of the sisters' voices could be heard from their rooms, no footsteps echoed from the upper floors, and even the normal sounds of settling wood and shifting furniture that characterized the large house in the evening seemed muted and strange. Most significantly, Mrs. Caldwell noticed that the usual preparations for the following day had not been completed. Typically, the sisters would lay out their clothing for the morning, prepare materials for their various activities, and complete small household tasks that would make the next day's routines more efficient. On the evening of October 12th, however, none of these preparations had been made, as if the sisters had abandoned their normal concern for future activities and focused entirely on immediate, undisclosed concerns. Gabriel claimed that he went to bed at his normal hour of 11:30, assuming that his daughters had already retired to their respective rooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors of the house. His account of his evening routine matched the pattern he had followed for years. A final check of the doors and windows, a brief prayer in the family's small chapel room, and retirement to the master bedroom that he had occupied alone since his wife's death during their journey to Montana. What happened during the hours between 11:30 on the evening of October 12th and dawn on October 13th remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire case. Gabriel maintained that he slept normally and heard nothing unusual during the night, yet the physical evidence discovered the following morning suggested that extraordinary and carefully coordinated activities had taken place throughout the house while he remained unaware in his bedroom. The discovery that would transform the Thornfield disappearance from a family crisis into a nationwide mystery began at dawn on October 13th when Mrs. Caldwell arrived to begin her daily routine of preparing breakfast and organizing the household for another day. Her key turned easily in the front door, which she found securely locked as she had left it the previous evening, and she entered the house expecting to encounter the familiar sounds and rhythms of a large family beginning their morning activities. Instead, she was greeted by a silence so profound and unnatural that she later described it as feeling like entering a tomb. No footsteps echoed from the upper floors, no voices called morning greetings, and even the mechanical sounds of the house, the ticking of clocks, the settling of wooden beams, the whisper of air moving through the rooms, seemed muted and strange. Mrs. Caldwell's first instinct was to attribute this unusual quiet to the family's having overslept, perhaps due to late-night activities or the effects of the unseasonably cold weather that had settled over Selkirk during the night. Her concern began to escalate when she discovered that the kitchen showed no signs of having been used for the late evening snack that was part of the family's established routine. The sisters typically prepared tea and light refreshments around 10 o'clock each evening, gathering in the kitchen to discuss the day's events and make plans for the following day. On the morning of October 13th, however, the kitchen remained exactly as Mrs. Caldwell had left it the previous evening: clean, organized, and completely unused. Growing more puzzled and concerned, Mrs. Caldwell climbed the main staircase to the second floor, where Margaret, Catherine, and the twins maintained their bedrooms. The hallway was eerily quiet, with none of the doors standing open, as was typical when the sisters were preparing for their morning activities. When Mrs. Caldwell knocked softly on Margaret's door and received no response, she hesitantly turned the handle and discovered a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Margaret's bedroom appeared precisely as it would have looked if she had never retired for the evening. The bed remained made with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized Margaret's approach to all aspects of her life. Corners tucked with geometric precision, pillows arranged symmetrically, and the coverlet stretched without a single wrinkle. Her nightgown hung on its customary hook near the window, exactly where she had placed it before dressing for dinner the previous evening. Her brush and comb sat in their usual positions on the dressing table, alongside the small stack of books she had been reading and the lesson plans she had prepared for the following day's classes. Yet, despite this appearance of perfect order, something felt profoundly wrong about the room. Mrs. Caldwell, who had cleaned and organized this space hundreds of times over the years, immediately sensed that subtle changes had occurred. The items on Margaret's dressing table, while arranged neatly, were not positioned with the exact precision that Margaret invariably maintained. Several books had been removed from their shelves and replaced in incorrect order, and the papers in Margaret's desk showed signs of having been examined and restacked by someone unfamiliar with her organizational system. The discovery in Catherine's room was equally disturbing and puzzling. Like Margaret's, the bed showed no signs of having been slept in, and Catherine's artistic materials, brushes, paints, and canvases were arranged with a neatness that was completely uncharacteristic of her normally chaotic creative space. Catherine typically left her room in a state of organized disorder that reflected her artistic temperament, with half-finished paintings propped against the walls and art supplies scattered across every available surface. On the morning of October 13th, however, everything had been cleaned and organized with an almost obsessive attention to detail that was entirely foreign to Catherine's personality. The twins' shared bedroom presented the most disturbing evidence of whatever had occurred during the night. Eleanor and Elizabeth had always maintained their space with identical precision, their belongings arranged in perfect symmetry that reflected their close relationship and shared habits. On the morning of the disappearance, however, their room showed clear signs of having been systematically searched by someone who had attempted to restore order, but lacked intimate knowledge of the twins' precise organizational methods. Dresser drawers had been opened and closed, their contents examined and replaced, but not in the exact patterns that the twins invariably maintained. Mrs. Caldwell's horror reached its peak when she climbed to the third floor and discovered that Sarah's, Grace's, and Rebecca's rooms told the same impossible story. 3 more beds that had never been slept in, 3 more sets of nightgowns hanging undisturbed, and 3 more rooms that showed subtle but unmistakable evidence of having been carefully searched by someone familiar with the house, but not intimately acquainted with each sister's personal habits and preferences. Her screams, when they finally came, echoed through the morning stillness with the intensity that brought neighbors running from blocks away. Mrs. Caldwell ran from the house in a state of near hysteria, stumbling through the streets of Selkirk and crying that the girls were gone, that something terrible had happened, that the impossible had somehow occurred in their safe and familiar community. Gabriel Thornfield, awakened by the commotion and the sound of voices gathering outside his home, initially refused to believe what Mrs. Caldwell was telling him. He rushed through the house, calling his daughters' names and checking each room with the desperate hope that some simple explanation would resolve the crisis. Instead, he was confronted with the same impossible evidence that had terrorized Mrs. Caldwell. 7 bedrooms that showed no signs of having been occupied during the night, yet clear indications that someone had methodically examined every personal belonging, every document, and every possession that the sisters had accumulated during their years in Selkirk. Sheriff William Harding arrived within minutes of being summoned, but nothing in his decade of law enforcement experience in frontier communities had prepared him for the methodical investigation that the Thornfield disappearance would require. Harding was accustomed to dealing with straightforward crimes: cattle rustling, claim jumping, occasional violence stemming from personal disputes or excessive drinking. The systematic vanishing of 7 young women from a locked house, without any evidence of forced entry or signs of struggle, presented challenges that exceeded both his experience and his resources. Harding's initial examination of the house confirmed Mrs. Caldwell's observations while revealing additional details that deepened the mystery rather than providing explanations. Every door and window in the house remained securely locked from the inside, with no evidence of tampering or forced entry. The front and back doors showed no signs of having been opened during the night, and the windows were all latched in their normal positions. Most puzzling of all, there were no footprints in the soft earth around the house's foundation, despite the fact that anyone entering or leaving the building during the night would necessarily have left clear tracks in the moisture-softened soil. The systematic search of the sisters' belongings became more apparent as Harding conducted a detailed examination of each room. In every case, personal items had been examined and replaced, but not with the precision that would indicate familiarity with each sister's habits. Clothing had been unfolded and refolded, jewelry had been examined and returned to boxes, and personal papers had been read and restacked. Yet nothing appeared to be missing. Valuable jewelry remained in plain sight, small amounts of money were undisturbed in dresser drawers, and even sentimental items that would be meaningful only to the sisters themselves remained exactly where they had always been kept. Sheriff Harding's investigation expanded systematically throughout Selkirk as he interviewed every resident who might have observed relevant details during the evening of October 12th or the early morning hours of October 13th. What emerged from these conversations was a pattern of strange occurrences and subtle disturbances that had been building throughout the summer and early autumn of 1899, creating an atmosphere of unease that many residents had noticed but few had been able to articulate clearly. Multiple witnesses reported seeing well-dressed strangers arriving on evening trains during the weeks leading up to the disappearance. These visitors, always impeccably dressed in expensive Eastern clothing and carrying expensive leather luggage, would conduct brief meetings with prominent citizens and then depart on the following morning's train without engaging in any of the normal social activities that characterized business visits to frontier communities. Their presence was noted not only because of their obvious wealth and sophistication, but also because of their deliberate avoidance of the kind of casual interaction that was customary in small communities where strangers were typically welcomed and included in social activities. The telegraph office confirmed an unusual volume of coded messages being sent to addresses in Chicago, New York, and San Francisco during the same period. Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk who had witnessed the sisters' final public appearance, revealed that these messages were typically sent late in the evening and consisted of seemingly random combinations of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him, but obviously conveyed specific information to their intended recipients. Most of these messages were sent by Gabriel Thornfield himself, though several other prominent citizens had also dispatched coded communications to the same Eastern addresses. The town's bank president, Charles Whitman, initially proved reluctant to discuss his institution's recent transactions, but Sheriff Harding's persistent questioning eventually revealed financial irregularities that cast Gabriel Thornfield's rapid success in an increasingly troubling light. During the 6 months preceding the disappearance, Gabriel had made several large withdrawals of gold coins, totaling amounts that represented a significant portion of his accumulated wealth. These withdrawals were unusual not only for their size, but also for their timing. They had occurred immediately following the visits of the mysterious Eastern strangers, suggesting a direct connection between these encounters and Gabriel's financial activities. More disturbing still were the bank's records of Gabriel's deposits and investments, which showed a pattern of wealth accumulation that seemed inconsistent with the profits that could reasonably be expected from operating a general store in a frontier community. Even accounting for the prosperity that the silver mines had brought to Selkirk, Gabriel's financial success appeared to far exceed what should have been possible through legitimate commercial activities. Whitman's records indicated that Gabriel had received regular payments from Eastern sources that had no apparent connection to his retail business, and these payments had increased substantially during the months leading up to his daughter's disappearance. As autumn stretched into winter, the case attracted attention from federal investigators and newspaper reporters from across the country. The story of the 7 missing sisters captivated the American public with its combination of mystery, tragedy, and hints of corruption that seemed to epitomize the darker aspects of frontier life. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco published detailed accounts of the disappearance, often accompanied by artists' renderings of the sisters and speculative theories about what might have happened to them. The federal investigation, led by Inspector Marcus Reed from the Department of Justice, brought resources and expertise that were far beyond what local authorities could provide. Reed had extensive experience investigating criminal organizations that operated across state and territorial boundaries, and his involvement in the Thornfield case reflected the federal government's growing concern about organized criminal activities in frontier communities. His investigation would eventually uncover evidence of corruption and criminality that extended far beyond the borders of Montana and involved some of the most prominent business and political figures in the American West. Inspector Reed's examination of Gabriel Thornfield's business records revealed financial irregularities that suggested connections to a sophisticated criminal organization. Gabriel's rapid accumulation of wealth coincided precisely with a series of questionable transactions involving mining claims, railroad contracts, and territorial government appointments. Most disturbing were his documented connections to a secretive investment group known as the Rocky Mountain Development Company, which had been acquiring mineral rights throughout Montana and other western territories using methods that local authorities were powerless to investigate or regulate. The Rocky Mountain Development Company proved to be a particularly elusive target for federal investigators. The organization operated through a complex network of subsidiary companies, shell corporations, and proxy agents that made it virtually impossible to identify its true owners or determine the source of its apparently unlimited financial resources. What Reed could establish was that the company had been systematically acquiring control of valuable natural resources throughout the West, often through arrangements that involved local officials and prominent citizens who received substantial payments in exchange for their cooperation. Gabriel Thornfield's relationship with this organization appeared to have begun shortly after his arrival in Selkirk, when he received what his records described as investment capital that enabled him to expand his business far beyond what would have been possible through normal commercial profits. In exchange for this financial support, Gabriel had apparently provided the organization with detailed information about local mining operations, land ownership patterns, and political developments that could affect business opportunities in the region. As winter settled over Selkirk and the immediate search for the 7 sisters gradually shifted from active investigation to cold case status, the town itself began to undergo changes that reflected the trauma and suspicion that the disappearance had generated. Several families, uncomfortable with the implications of the federal investigation and the attention that the case had brought to their community, decided to seek opportunities elsewhere. New residents arrived who had no connection to the tragedy and no investment in uncovering the truth about what had happened to the Thornfield sisters. Gabriel himself became an increasingly reclusive figure who rarely left his empty mansion except to visit the cemetery where he had erected 7 marble headstones despite the absence of bodies to bury beneath them. His general store, once the center of commercial and social activity in Selkirk, was sold to new owners who had no knowledge of or interest in the mysterious circumstances that had led to Gabriel's withdrawal from community life. The new proprietors found that many of Gabriel's business records had been destroyed or removed, making it impossible to understand the full extent of his financial relationships or the source of his former prosperity. The physical evidence of the sisters' former presence gradually disappeared from Selkirk as well. Their clothing and personal belongings were packed away in the mansion's attic. Their artistic and literary contributions to community life were replaced by new activities organized by recent arrivals. And even their names began to fade from daily conversation as residents focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on a mystery that seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. By the spring of 1901, many of Selkirk's original residents had departed for opportunities in other communities, taking with them their memories, suspicions, and theories about what had really happened to the Seven Sisters. The town that emerged from this transition bore little resemblance to the close-knit community that had existed before October 13, 1899. In its place was a more impersonal settlement populated largely by people who had no emotional investment in the Thornfield tragedy and no interest in pursuing investigations that might threaten their own opportunities for prosperity and advancement. The transformation of Selkirk from a community united by shared history and mutual support into a collection of strangers focused primarily on individual advancement reflected broader changes that were occurring throughout the American West as the 19th century drew to a close. The frontier's promise of limitless opportunity and democratic equality was increasingly challenged by the reality of organized exploitation, systematic corruption, and the growing power of Eastern financial interests that viewed Western communities as sources of natural resources rather than as collections of human beings deserving protection and respect. 23 years after the disappearance that had shattered the Thornfield family and transformed the community of Selkirk, a discovery in Chicago would reopen the case and reveal connections that stretched far beyond the borders of Montana Territory. In the spring of 1922, during the demolition of an abandoned warehouse on the city's south side, construction workers uncovered a hidden room that had been concealed behind false walls and forgotten for decades. The chamber contained dozens of filing cabinets, storage boxes, and personal items that told the story of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among the artifacts discovered in this hidden archive were 7 small photographs, each showing one of the Thornfield sisters in formal poses that suggested professional studio work. The images were accompanied by detailed written descriptions of each sister's personality, skills, family background, and physical characteristics, compiled with the kind of thoroughness that suggested commercial rather than personal interest. Most disturbing of all, the photographs appeared to have been taken after the sisters' disappearance from Selkirk, as several showed the young women at ages they had never reached in their Montana home. Margaret appeared to be in her 30s in the photograph, her face showing the maturity and gravity that came with adult responsibilities and experiences. Catherine's image captured her in elegant clothing that suggested prosperity and social status, but her eyes held a sadness that seemed incompatible with material success. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, had been photographed separately rather than together, their identical features showing subtle differences that suggested they had developed distinct personalities during their years of separation from each other and their family. Sarah's photograph showed her in formal attire that suggested she had maintained her involvement in religious or charitable activities, but the expression on her face conveyed a profound melancholy that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. Grace, captured in what appeared to be her mid-20s, wore the clothing of a woman engaged in professional activities, but her once bright eyes seemed dulled by experiences that had crushed her natural optimism and intellectual curiosity. Most heartbreaking of all was Rebecca's image, which showed her as a young woman in her early 20s, beautiful and properly dressed, but with none of the infectious joy and laughter that had made her beloved in Selkirk. Detective John Sullivan of the Chicago Police Department, who had been investigating the warehouse discovery as part of a broader inquiry into organized crime activities, immediately recognized the significance of these photographs and the accompanying documentation. The materials were part of a vast archive that detailed the operations of what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal organization specializing in what they euphemistically referred to as domestic placement services and social advancement opportunities for frontier families. The organization's records, maintained with meticulous attention to detail over several decades, revealed a business model that was both ingenious and horrifying in its systematic exploitation of vulnerable families throughout the American West. The criminals had identified communities and families whose isolation, economic struggles, or social circumstances made them susceptible to offers that promised better lives for their children, particularly their daughters. They operated through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses, employment agencies, matrimonial services, educational institutions, and charitable organizations that provided perfect cover for their actual activities. Detective Sullivan's investigation revealed that the organization had been operating under various names and through multiple front companies since at least 1885, systematically targeting families in frontier communities where law enforcement was limited and communication with outside authorities was difficult or impossible. Their methods involved careful research into local conditions, identification of families who might be vulnerable to financial pressure or social manipulation, and the deployment of sophisticated confidence schemes designed to convince parents that they were providing their daughters with opportunities for advancement and prosperity. The process typically began with the arrival of well-dressed strangers who presented themselves as representatives of Eastern businesses, educational institutions, or social organizations seeking to recruit young women for positions that promised significant financial rewards and social advancement. These recruiters carried impressive credentials, letters of recommendation from prominent figures, and detailed proposals that seemed to offer genuine opportunities for families struggling with the limitations and hardships of frontier life. Parents who expressed interest in these opportunities were gradually drawn into increasingly complex arrangements that involved financial investments, business partnerships, or other commitments that made it difficult for them to withdraw from the process once it had begun. The organization's representatives were skilled at identifying each family's particular vulnerabilities, financial pressures, social ambitions, concerns about their daughters' futures in isolated communities, and crafting proposals that addressed these specific concerns, while gradually increasing the family's dependence on the organization's resources and expertise. The final stage of the process involved the actual removal of the young women from their families and communities, typically accomplished through elaborate deceptions that convinced both the victims and their families that they were participating in legitimate opportunities for advancement. In some cases, the young women were told they were traveling to distant cities for employment or educational opportunities, while their families were informed that their daughters had decided to pursue independent lives in more sophisticated urban environments. Detective Sullivan's investigation into the Thornfield case specifically revealed that Gabriel's involvement with the organization had begun much earlier than anyone in Selkirk had realized. The hidden archive contained correspondence dating back to 1893, just 1 year after Gabriel's arrival in Montana, indicating that his rapid business success had been facilitated by the organization in exchange for his cooperation in their activities. Gabriel had apparently served as a local agent who identified suitable families and helped coordinate the organization's operations throughout the Montana Territory. The letters between Gabriel and his handlers revealed a man who had gradually become trapped in a web of obligations and dependencies that he was powerless to escape. His initial involvement had been relatively minor, providing information about local families and serving as a character reference for the organization's representatives when they arrived in Selkirk. However, His role had expanded over time as the organization's leaders recognized his intelligence, local influence, and desperate need for the financial support they provided. By 1899, Gabriel's position had become untenable as federal investigators began examining the organization's activities, and local residents became increasingly suspicious of the strange visitors and mysterious business dealings that had characterized Selkirk's recent prosperity. The organization's leaders had apparently decided that Gabriel's usefulness was outweighed by the risk he represented, and they had demanded that he fulfill his ultimate obligation to them by providing his own daughters as compensation for the investments they had made in his success. The correspondence revealed Gabriel's growing desperation as he realized the true nature of what was being demanded of him. His letters showed a man torn between his love for his daughters and his terror of the consequences that would follow if he refused to cooperate with the organization's demands. The threats against his family and community were subtle but unmistakable. Business failures, legal prosecutions, physical violence, and social ostracism that would destroy everything he had worked to build in Montana. Most tragic of all were Gabriel's attempts to find alternatives that would satisfy the organization's demands without sacrificing his daughters. He had apparently explored various possibilities, offering additional financial payments, proposing to recruit other families' daughters, and even suggesting that he relocate his entire family to a distant state where they would be beyond the organization's reach. All of these proposals had been rejected, and Gabriel had been informed that only the surrender of his 7 daughters would satisfy his obligations and ensure his family's safety. The final entries in Gabriel's correspondence, dated just days before the disappearance, revealed a man who had accepted the inevitable while desperately hoping that his daughters would somehow survive and eventually forgive him for his catastrophic failure to protect them. He had been assured that his daughters would be well treated, provided with comfortable lives, and married to wealthy gentlemen who would appreciate their frontier virtues and provide them with social and economic advantages they could never achieve in Montana. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in this conspiracy deepens beyond anything we could have imagined. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this devastating tale of betrayal and systematic exploitation. The revelation of Gabriel's correspondence and the organization's systematic methods sent shockwaves through American law enforcement agencies and sparked a nationwide investigation into similar disappearances throughout the West. Detective Sullivan's discovery had exposed not just the fate of the Thornfield sisters, but evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated with near impunity for decades, destroying hundreds of families while enriching a network of criminals who had corrupted officials at every level of government. As federal agents delved deeper into the organization's records, they uncovered evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial and state governments, federal law enforcement agencies, and even congressional offices in Washington, D.C. Judges had been systematically bribed or coerced into ignoring missing person cases and dismissing legal challenges that threatened to expose the organization's activities. Sheriffs and territorial marshals had received regular payments to suppress investigations and intimidate families who attempted to pursue cases involving their missing daughters. Most shocking of all was the discovery that several prominent politicians and business leaders had been active participants in the organization's operations, using their official positions to facilitate the trafficking of young women, while publicly advocating for law and order and family values. These hypocrites had enriched themselves through the systematic destruction of frontier families, while presenting themselves as pillars of their communities and champions of American moral values. The scope of the conspiracy became apparent as investigators traced the organization's financial records and identified the full extent of their operations. Over 300 young women from frontier communities throughout Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California had been trafficked through the network between 1885 and 1910. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 26, and they had been selected based on their physical attractiveness, intelligence, skills, and family circumstances that made them particularly valuable in the illegal marriage market. The organization's operations had been facilitated by technological and social changes that characterized the late 19th century American West. The expansion of railroad networks had made it possible to transport victims quickly and efficiently across vast distances, while the isolation of frontier communities and the limitations of communication systems had made it virtually impossible for families to track their missing daughters or coordinate with law enforcement agencies in distant jurisdictions. The criminal enterprise had also exploited the social and economic vulnerabilities that were endemic to frontier life during this period. Families struggling with poverty, social isolation, and limited opportunities for their children's advancement had been particularly susceptible to offers that promised better lives through arrangements that seemed legitimate and beneficial. The organization's representatives had been skilled at identifying these vulnerabilities and crafting proposals that addressed each family's specific concerns, while gradually drawing them into arrangements that they would never have accepted if they had understood the true nature of what was being proposed. In Selkirk itself, the investigation's revelations split the community between those who demanded justice for the Thornfield sisters and accountability for the officials who had enabled their disappearance, and those who feared the economic and social consequences of pursuing investigations that would expose the extent of local involvement in the conspiracy. Many residents had benefited either directly or indirectly from Gabriel Thornfield's prosperity and the investments that the Rocky Mountain Development Company had made in local businesses and infrastructure. The town's mayor, banker, and several prominent merchants found themselves implicated in the cover-up that had followed the sisters' disappearance, having received payments to suppress questions and discourage investigations that might have exposed the truth years earlier. Several local officials had known or suspected that Gabriel's wealth came from questionable sources, but they had chosen to remain silent in exchange for the economic benefits that his prosperity brought to their community. The most shocking discovery in Selkirk came when investigators examined the records of the local cemetery and discovered that the 7 marble headstones Gabriel had erected for his daughters contained a hidden message that revealed his knowledge of their fate. The dates carved into the monuments did not represent the sisters' deaths, as everyone had assumed, but rather the dates when they had been forced into arranged marriages in distant cities. Gabriel had been informed of each placement and had marked the occasion with what appeared to be a memorial, but was actually a record of his daughter's enslavement. The revelation that Gabriel had known his daughter's fates all along and had chosen to maintain the fiction of their mysterious disappearance rather than expose the truth and risk retaliation against other families transformed him from a tragic victim into a willing participant in their destruction. His suicide note, discovered after his death in Denver, revealed that his guilt and despair had driven him to madness, but also that he had possessed information that could have led to his daughter's rescue if he had found the courage to reveal it to authorities. As the federal investigation expanded, it became apparent that the organization responsible for the Thornfield tragedy had not been dismantled in 1910 as previously believed, but had simply evolved and adapted to changing social and economic conditions. By 1922, the network had transformed itself into what appeared to be a collection of legitimate employment agencies, matrimonial services, and social organizations, but continued to operate using refined versions of the same predatory methods that had destroyed the Thornfield family. The modernized operation had adapted to urban environments and changing social norms while maintaining its fundamental business model of exploiting vulnerable young women and their families. Instead of targeting isolated frontier communities, the organization now focused on recent immigrants, rural families displaced by economic changes, and urban families struggling with poverty and social dislocation in rapidly growing cities. The final pieces of the Thornfield mystery fell into place when federal investigators, armed with evidence from the Chicago warehouse and Gabriel's correspondence, launched a coordinated series of raids across 12 states, In the spring of 1922, the operation, involving over 200 federal agents and local law enforcement officers, targeted the modernized network that had evolved from the organization responsible for the sisters' disappearance, while simultaneously searching for any surviving victims of the original trafficking operation. The raids yielded evidence that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations. In addition to liberating dozens of women who were still being held against their will in various forms of involuntary servitude, the operation uncovered detailed records that documented the fates of hundreds of missing persons, including comprehensive information about the Thornfield sisters and their experiences following their removal from Selkirk. Margaret Thornfield, investigators learned, had been transported to Cleveland and forced into marriage with Harrison Pembroke, a steel mill owner who had specifically requested a bride with teaching experience and intellectual capabilities. The marriage had been presented to Margaret as a legitimate arrangement that would provide her with social status and financial security while allowing her to pursue her educational interests in a more sophisticated urban environment. The reality had been far different. Pembroke had treated her as little more than an ornamental possession whose primary value lay in her ability to enhance his social reputation and provide him with children who would inherit her intelligence and refinement. Margaret had borne 3 children during her years of captivity, but she had been forbidden from contacting her family or revealing her true identity to anyone, including her own children, who had been told that their mother was an orphan with no living relatives. Her attempts to escape had been thwarted by Pembroke's connections to the trafficking network, which maintained surveillance over all their placed women to prevent exposure of their operations and to ensure that the victims remained compliant with their arrangements. The investigators found Margaret living under the name Mary Patterson in a comfortable but closely monitored environment where her every activity was controlled by Pembroke and his associates. Despite nearly 23 years of captivity, she had maintained her intelligence and strength of character, secretly documenting her experiences and gathering evidence that she hoped would someday lead to justice for herself and other victims. Her hidden journals provided investigators with crucial details about the organization's operations and the locations where other victims might be found. Catherine's fate had been equally tragic, but had followed a different pattern of exploitation. She had been taken to Milwaukee and married to Augustus Richardson, an art collector who had specifically sought a wife with artistic talents that he could exploit for both personal pleasure and commercial gain. Richardson had forced Catherine to produce paintings that he sold under his own name, while keeping her isolated from artistic communities where she might have found support or assistance. The psychological torture that Catherine had endured was evident in the paintings that investigators found in Richardson's mansion. Works that showed remarkable technical skill, but conveyed a profound sadness and desperation that reflected their creator's emotional state. Catherine, now living as Caroline Phillips, had survived by channeling her anguish into her art, while secretly planning for an escape that she had never been able to achieve due to the constant surveillance and threats that characterized her captivity. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, had been deliberately separated as part of a calculated strategy to break their emotional bond and make them more compliant with their captor's demands. Eleanor had been placed in St. Louis with Marcus Whitfield, a businessman who had wanted a wife who would manage his household and social affairs with frontier efficiency and reliability. The separation from her twin sister had caused Eleanor such profound psychological trauma that she had suffered a complete mental breakdown within months of her arrival in St. Louis. Elizabeth had been taken to Chicago and forced into marriage with Samuel Henderson, a banker who had valued her practical skills and frontier hardiness, but had shown no interest in her emotional well-being or personal happiness. The loss of her sister and the trauma of her captivity had transformed Elizabeth from the outgoing, confident young woman she had been in Selkirk into a withdrawn, fearful person who lived in constant dread of punishment or retaliation. The investigation revealed that both twins had been told that their sister had died. a lie designed to prevent them from attempting to contact each other and to eliminate any hope of eventual reunion. This deliberate cruelty had been part of the organization's standard operating procedures for victims who had particularly close family relationships that might motivate escape attempts or resistance to their captors' demands. Sarah's story proved to be one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the entire case. She had been transported to Detroit and forced into marriage with Reverend Jonathan Morrison, a prominent minister who had specifically requested a wife with musical abilities and religious background. Morrison had exploited Sarah's talents by forcing her to perform in his church and at social events while presenting himself as a devoted husband and religious leader. The investigators discovered that Sarah had died in 1905, officially from pneumonia, but evidence suggested that her death had resulted from years of physical and emotional abuse that had weakened her constitution and made her susceptible to illness. Morrison had refused to provide adequate medical care during her final illness, apparently viewing her death as an opportunity to request a replacement wife from the trafficking organization. Grace's mathematical abilities had made her particularly valuable to the organization's leaders, who had placed her with Theodore Blackstone, a Chicago businessman who had used her skills to manage his complex financial operations while keeping her isolated from any contact with the outside world. Grace had been forced to use her intellectual gifts to facilitate criminal activities, including money laundering and fraudulent investment schemes that had enriched Blackstone while destroying the financial security of countless innocent victims. The investigators found evidence that Grace had tried repeatedly to sabotage Blackstone's operations by introducing subtle errors into his financial calculations, hoping to expose his criminal activities to authorities. These acts of resistance had been discovered, however, and Grace had been subjected to increasingly severe punishments that had eventually broken her spirit and destroyed her health. She had died in childbirth in 1909, alone and far from any family support, after being denied proper medical care by a husband who viewed her primarily as a valuable asset, rather than a human being deserving of compassion and respect. Rebecca's fate was perhaps the most tragic of all the sisters, as her youth had made her unsuitable for immediate placement and had resulted in years of captivity in various holding facilities, while the organization's leaders waited for her to reach an age that would make her marketable to their clients. During these years, Rebecca had been moved frequently between different locations, never allowed to form lasting relationships or to develop any sense of stability or security. The constant relocations and the psychological trauma of separation from her family had taken a severe toll on Rebecca's physical and mental health. By the time she reached an age where placement might have been possible, her deteriorated condition had made her unsuitable for the kind of arrangements that the organization typically facilitated. She had died of tuberculosis in 1907, having spent the last years of her short life in a facility that was little more than a prison for unwanted victims who could no longer serve the organization's commercial purposes. The trials that followed the 1922 arrests became a national sensation that exposed not only the Thornfield case, but also the systematic exploitation of vulnerable families throughout the American frontier during the previous 4 decades. Newspaper coverage of the proceedings revealed details about the trafficking operation that shocked the public and led to demands for comprehensive reforms in law enforcement, interstate commerce regulation, and protection of women's rights. Marcus Pemberton, the criminal mastermind who had orchestrated the trafficking network, was arrested at his Chicago mansion in a dramatic raid that uncovered additional evidence of his crimes and revealed the full extent of his wealth and political connections. Pemberton's trial revealed him to be a man of extraordinary intelligence and organizational ability who had perverted these gifts into the creation of a criminal empire that had operated with near impunity for decades. During his testimony, Pemberton showed no remorse for the hundreds of lives he had destroyed, instead expressing pride in what he characterized as a successful business enterprise that had provided valuable services to clients who appreciated the superior qualities of frontier-raised women. His cold, calculating demeanor and complete lack of empathy for his victims horrified even hardened court observers and provided clear evidence of the sociopathic personality that had enabled him to commit such systematic crimes against vulnerable families. 17 of Pemberton's associates were convicted alongside him on various charges related to kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and corruption of public officials. The evidence presented during their trials revealed the sophisticated nature of the organization's operations and the extent of the corruption that had enabled their crimes to continue undetected for so long. However, the web of corruption and complicity that had enabled the trafficking operation meant that many participants escaped prosecution due to destroyed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and the convenient deaths of key figures before they could testify. Several prominent politicians, judges, and business leaders who had clearly been involved in the conspiracy managed to avoid criminal charges through their political connections and financial resources, though their reputations were permanently destroyed by the revelations that emerged during the trials. The 3 surviving Thornfield sisters faced an agonizing choice when investigators offered them the opportunity to testify publicly and seek justice for their suffering. Testifying would mean revealing their true identities and destroying the lives they had built during their years of captivity, potentially endangering their children and exposing them to retaliation from surviving members of the criminal organization. Margaret, now 49 years old and living as Mary Patterson, chose to testify despite the personal cost involved. Her courage in confronting her captors and revealing the details of her 23 years of enslavement made her a powerful advocate for other trafficking victims and helped establish legal precedents that would provide better protection for women and families in vulnerable situations. Her testimony was particularly effective because of her intelligence, dignity, and ability to articulate the psychological and emotional damage that the trafficking experience had inflicted on its victims. Catherine and Elizabeth, however, chose to maintain their assumed identities and live quietly with the terrible knowledge of their past. Catherine, now living as Caroline Phillips, had established a life in Milwaukee that included children who knew nothing of her true background, and she felt that revealing the truth would destroy their happiness and security without providing any meaningful benefit to other victims. Elizabeth, still living as Ellen Pierce in St. Louis, had never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of separation from her twin sister and felt emotionally incapable of reliving her experiences through public testimony. The decision to remain silent was respected by the investigators, who understood that these women had already sacrificed enough and had no obligation to expose themselves to further trauma in pursuit of justice that might ultimately prove elusive. Their choice to preserve the lives they had built also reflected the complex reality that many trafficking victims faced: the need to balance the desire for justice against the practical requirements of survival and protection of their families. The town of Selkirk itself never fully recovered from the revelation of what had happened to its most prominent family and the exposure of the corruption that had enabled their tragedy. Many longtime residents chose to leave rather than continue living in a community that had been built on such a horrific foundation of exploitation and betrayal. The Thornfield mansion, which had stood empty since Gabriel's departure for Denver, was eventually torn down in 1925, and the lot was left vacant as if the community was trying to erase all physical reminders of the family's fate. The 7 marble headstones in the cemetery were replaced with a single monument bearing the inscription, "To the 7 sisters, victims of greed and betrayal, may truth finally set you free." The new memorial was funded by contributions from residents throughout Montana who had been moved by the sisters' story and wanted to ensure that their sacrifice would not be forgotten by future generations. The broader impact of the Thornfield case extended far beyond Montana's borders and contributed to significant reforms in how missing person cases were handled throughout the United States. New federal laws were passed requiring greater oversight of employment agencies and matrimonial services, and interstate cooperation in criminal investigations was significantly improved through the establishment of new communication systems and standardized procedures for sharing information between law enforcement agencies. Perhaps most importantly, the case revealed how economic desperation and social isolation could make entire communities vulnerable to exploitation by sophisticated criminal organizations. The frontier territory's lack of adequate law enforcement and communication networks had created perfect conditions for predators like Pemberton's organization to operate with impunity, destroying countless families while enriching themselves through systematic human trafficking. The investigation also highlighted the particular vulnerability of young women in frontier communities, where limited economic opportunities and social restrictions made them dependent on their families' decisions about their futures. The trafficking organization had exploited these social conditions by presenting themselves as providers of opportunities that would otherwise be unavailable to frontier families, while actually delivering their victims into forms of slavery that were often worse than the limitations they had supposedly escaped. The legacy of the Thornfield case continued to influence American law enforcement and social policy for decades after the trials concluded. The evidence gathered during the investigation provided crucial insights into the methods used by trafficking organizations and helped develop more effective strategies for preventing similar crimes. The case also contributed to growing awareness of the need to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation and to address the social and economic conditions that made such exploitation possible. This tragedy shows us how desperation can blind us to evil, and how the pursuit of prosperity can lead to the destruction of everything we claim to value most. Gabriel Thornfield's desire to provide better lives for his daughters made him susceptible to a deception that ultimately destroyed everything he held dear, while the sisters themselves became victims of a system that valued their youth, beauty, and innocence as commodities to be bought and sold, rather than as human beings deserving of protection and respect. The seven sisters of Selkirk paid the ultimate price for their father's ambition and their society's willingness to look the other way when profits were involved. But their story also demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of seeking truth and justice, even when doing so requires tremendous personal sacrifice. Margaret's courage in testifying against her captors, despite the personal cost involved, helped ensure that other victims would receive better protection and that the criminals responsible for these crimes would face the justice they had evaded for so long. The mystery of what happened to the seven sisters of Selkirk ultimately became a story about the price of the American dream and the vulnerability of those who pursued it without adequate protection from the predators who lurked at the edges of frontier society. Their tragedy reminds us that progress and prosperity mean nothing if they are built on the suffering of the innocent, and that true civilization requires not just material advancement, but also the moral courage to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their desperation and destroy their hopes for a better life. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in the files of this century-old conspiracy? The evidence suggests that the trafficking network was even larger than investigators were able to prove, and that similar crimes may have occurred in frontier communities throughout the West without ever being detected or reported. Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really happened in Selkirk and whether other families may have suffered similar fates. If you enjoyed this tale of historical mystery and want more stories from America's dark past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chilling chapter from our nation's hidden history.